Over the years in comics, one thing it's kind of funny, and it's one of those entertaining pieces that so little people know about. And it's in my mind one of the funnest parts of comics, and that's the rivalry between Marvel and DC. Now, I'm not talking about the fans. I'm talking about the companies themselves. And if you're a wrestling fan, particularly during the WCW, WWF days, this will probably entertain you. Hey, everybody, this is Perch. The Marvel DC battle has gone on forever. And if you want to know how long forever, we're coming up on 100 years. A lot of the battles back when you had Superman and the Human Torch, and then again in the 60s, these kind of little squabbles between the companies have gone on for a long time. And one of the reasons they've gone on for a long time is they're not terribly heated, and yet they are. And what I mean by that is it's not enough ever to push it into legal action, not rarely, lots of legal action threatened, but rarely actually, done. But it is enough that you get these constant little almost Cold War-like fights. And in many cases, these fights are super petty. And that's kind of the comedy of it all. Now, the people within the two companies, Marvel and DC, suspected that the other company was out to screw them, and not just like, not just in simple ways like outselling the others or other things. I'm talking about like calling distributors and playing pranks, kind of like you see in like an 80s movie where the villains like will call up the rivals, like the gym where they're practicing and get it shut down for a health code violation to interfere with their training. It's that level of stuff. In fact, one of the craziest parts, and this is a true story, is back in the early 70s, 1971. DC became convinced that Marvel was spying on them, that they had an employee there that was leaking secrets out of the company and basically telling Marvel what DC had planned. And, like any normal company, what does DC do? They come up with a counter-op where they're going to deliberately produce some fake memos and fake, plans for their comics, and then they're going to leave them lying around to see if a spy will, retrieve them and give them to Marvel. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, that's crazy talk, except it turns out there was a spy in DC. This weird operation, which was codenamed Blockbuster, created a fake memo about the company's plans to publish these 500-page comics, these giant, zines are going to be the biggest comic. In a crazy way, it was the early Shonen Jump. Not exactly, but anyway, so this absolutely ludicrous idea goes out, totally paranoid that somebody would steal it and deliver it to Marvel. And but sure enough, like this document was left around, and 2 weeks later, Marvel is making their own plans for doing 500-page comics, and then I guess word got back that it was all just a gag, and then it was dropped. But I mean, this is the kind of stuff that went on, and this happened at every level. You had the various kind of battles back and forth around creators. You'd make a big deal when John Byrne jumped over to DC. You had this huge fanfare. You had the Jim Shooter era at Marvel, and then Jim Shooter gets removed. And when Jim Shooter left Marvel, apparently this anonymous wreath and this kind of a funeral arrangement was sent over to Marvel by, presumably somebody at DC, but nobody knows, but probably. But when we get into like more modern stuff, I know the stories around like Mark Waid sending the wreath to somebody and kind of these kind of petty kind of arguments. And you're like, wow, how do people do that? Well, it's because the parent companies were doing it themselves and for many, many years doing it themselves. That's just the nature of the business that had been kind of pulled together. Another example, so I mean, we all know about kind of Wonder Woman. So in 1964, Marvel introduces Wonder Man. DC is pissed because it sounds like Wonder Woman. So after a bunch of squabbles, Marvel agrees to kill off Wonder Man. So, it doesn't matter. But then DC creates Power Girl, which a year and a half after Marvel created Power Man. So Stan Lee was apparently furious about this, felt like somebody had stabbed him in the back, betrayed whatever agreement he had with Wonder Man. So he insists that they bring Wonder Man back to life. And and then they, it's just that kind of stuff is bizarre. Now, the only thing more petty that would sometimes take place is when Marvel and DC would actually team up and basically try and file trademarks together and sue everyone outside of themselves for various copyrights. The famous one that people have talked about is for superhero, but there were just so many of these little battles back and forth, and in some cases during the 80s and the 90s, it was big business. We had the newsstand going, the direct market going, and we had creators who were starting to take more money. Then the shock of a bunch of Marvel creators going off to Image, and that was that moment in time was also a case where the paranoia started to rise, the pettiness also started to come in, and that's where I think you see a lot of what you have today. And I used the analogy at the beginning: if you're a fan of wrestling and kind of the various shenanigans that would go on between Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff, and kind of Vince Russo was in there, and these kinds of little petty attacks that the companies would give each other. I mean, the other thing about comics is there are just what has to be hundreds and probably over time, maybe thousands of Easter eggs put into comics of names of books on bookshelves or T-shirts that people in the background are wearing and everything else, taking subtle and sometimes not so subtle jabs at the creators and the people in the other company, and oftentimes aimed at the editorial board or kind of the management. And sometimes these things are kind of harmless, like somebody has a big nose. There are a ton of kind of very subtle racist jabs at people in the other companies around usually Jewish type jokes and other things. But beyond that, you'd get talks about, like, if somebody on the editorial team had a divorce, you'd have like that person's name showing up in a comic book around, maybe somebody, a trial attorney. Back in She-Hulk, there was a ton of this that was used, and you saw it also pop up in some of the Batman comics at the time. This would go on a lot. And it was almost considered, I don't want to say a frat house type of behavior, but it was considered a part of the fun. And it's weird because people have come in and they've done little exposés, or they've done little books on this. There's a very, very good book that, if you haven't read it, called Slugfest, and it's by Reed Tucker, and it goes over the battle between the two companies. But the crazy part is he's going here and he's looking into all these different pieces, all these different little battles and everything else, and he comes to the conclusion what a great place it would be to work at. Like how cool, both Marvel and DC. He prefers Marvel, but he talks about how super fun it would be because they had a laid back culture with wrestling matches and silly string fights in the hallways, and that it was a fun, crazy place to work. So after covering these weird kind of petty fights back and forth, which sometimes are tongue-in-cheek, sometimes harmless, sometimes are poking fun of somebody's personal pain, and definitely as we look at today, and people are questioning, like, how could the comic industry have developed this environment of sexual harassment and all the rest. All these allegations come out, and people are scratching their heads. And Kelly Sue DeConnick's like, this is like we need it. This is why we need an agent system like what Hollywood has to protect from harassment, because that works out great for Hollywood. I'm just saying. But it's funny how after seeing all this stuff, somebody's like, yeah, and I want in. And then at the same time, people go, I just don't know how comics got so immature. I don't know how it got so like how this stuff goes on. I just don't understand it. I mean, the groundwork is all there. Like, it's all clearly there. It's just funny to me. I mean, like I said, the Marvel DC rivalry has gone on for a long time. The behind the scenes stuff ranges from hilariously wacky and paranoid to weird little moments. If you've ever wondered why a character that you really liked suddenly became less pushed, seemed to die off for no apparent reason, get moved from one character to another, maybe it was because of good story planning, or maybe it was because there was some kind of strange battle that was going on behind the scenes. And your characters, your stories, the things you're supposed to be enjoying is like a caught in the crossfire. It's just amazing. Anyway, do you have any? I mean, we've all heard of these kind of legendary stories of lore, but do you have any? Leave them in the comments below. And also, what do you think? Is on one hand, is it like, I'm glad that these companies work this way, kind of, off the cuff, having fun? Or on the other hand, you look at this and go, yeah, this probably is why there's just the problems there is. And, maybe the culture is ingrained in such a way that, it's a bigger problem to solve. Let me know. Leave me a comment below. Let me know what you think. Hey, like, subscribe. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you very much for all the people who have. I really appreciate this community we built here together. And yeah, follow me on social media, send me an email, all the rest. Most importantly, of course, thanks for listening.